Okay, so you want to own a clothing brand. Good news, this is one of the easiest businesses in the world to start. A Shopify account, a manufacturer on Alibaba, and an Instagram page is all it technically takes. In 2024, there were an estimated 20,000 new apparel brands launched in the United States alone. It sounds like the perfect business. Low barrier to entry, no factory required, no physical storefront needed, and a product every human being on Earth already buys. It is not that simple. An estimated 80 to 90% of new clothing brands fail within the first 2 years, and most of them fail while sitting on a bank account full of unsold inventory. By the end of this video, you will understand why a hoodie that costs $8 to make and sells for $60 can still bankrupt the person selling it, and you will understand the one number hiding behind every sale that decides whether a clothing brand becomes a real business or a very expensive hobby. Let's start with the number everyone gets excited about: the markup. A basic cotton hoodie costs somewhere between $6 and $10 to manufacture overseas, depending on fabric weight and order size. Sell it for $60, and on paper, that's a $50 profit, a 500% return on a piece of fabric and thread. It looks like the easiest math in retail. That number is a lie, or at least an incomplete one. The $8 only covers the factory's invoice. It does not include the cost of shipping a container from a factory in Vietnam or Bangladesh to a warehouse in the United States, which alone can add $1 to $3 per unit, depending on freight rates. It does not include import duties, which for apparel typically run between 10 and 32%, depending on the fabric and country of origin. It does not include warehousing, packaging, or the cost of a defective batch that has to be scrapped. By the time that hoodie is sitting in a warehouse ready to ship to a customer, the real cost has usually crept up to somewhere between $15 and $22. Still a healthy margin, but this is where the real spending only begins. The gross margin looks good on a spreadsheet. It does not survive contact with the internet. Almost every new clothing brand today is built on Meta and TikTok advertising, and the cost of acquiring a single paying customer through those platforms has been climbing for years. Industry benchmarks for fashion e-commerce commonly put customer acquisition cost somewhere between $15 and $40 per customer, and in saturated categories like streetwear or athleisure, it can run higher. That's before the customer has bought anything. That's just the cost of getting them to click. Then there are returns. Clothing has one of the highest return rates of any product category sold online, commonly estimated between 20 and 30%, driven almost entirely by one unsolvable problem: sizing. A customer cannot try on a hoodie before it ships. When it comes back, the brand pays for the return shipping, often can't resell it as new once the packaging is opened, and sometimes eats the entire cost as a loss. A 20% return rate doesn't just cost 20% of revenue. It costs the shipping both ways, the restocking labor and the lost sale to a competitor while the item was in transit. Add the marketing cost, the return rate, and the payment processing fees that every online store pays on every transaction, and that $50 paper profit on the hoodie quietly shrinks down to somewhere between $5 and $15 of real profit. Sometimes it disappears completely. This is why a brand can post $1 million in annual revenue and still lose money. Revenue is a headline number. Profit is what's left after the 11 invisible expenses nobody puts in the Instagram caption. But even that isn't the part that actually kills most clothing brands. The part that kills them is sitting in a warehouse. Here's the mechanism nobody explains to a first-time founder. To get a reasonable per-unit cost from a factory, you have to order in bulk. Most manufacturers require a minimum order of 300 to 1,000 units per style, and you have to place that order and pay for it months before you know whether anyone actually wants to buy it. You are betting real money on a guess about a color, a fit, and a fashion trend that could shift by the time the shipment clears customs. Guess right, and the brand sells out in a week and looks like an overnight success story. Guess wrong, and you own a warehouse full of size medium hoodies in a color nobody wanted, still costing you rent every single month, whether they sell or not. This is called inventory risk, and it is the single largest financial exposure in the entire clothing industry. It's also invisible from the outside. A brand can have a beautiful website, a large following, and decent sales, and still be sliding toward bankruptcy because 40% of its cash is frozen in unsold stock, sitting on a shelf. Not every brand plays this game the same way, and the model you choose changes almost everything downstream. On one end, you have the fast fashion model, companies like Inditex, the parent of Zara, or the online retailer Shein, which compress the time between design and shelf shelf down to a matter of weeks instead of months, running on thin per-item margins made up for entirely by volume and speed. That model requires a level of supply chain infrastructure that took Inditex decades and billions of dollars to build. It is not available to a new founder with a Shopify store. The model most new founders actually use is direct-to-consumer, building an identity-driven brand online and selling straight to the customer, skipping physical retail entirely. Gymshark is the most cited example of this working. It started in a garage in the United Kingdom, was built almost entirely on fitness influencer partnerships instead of traditional advertising, and grew into a company reportedly valued north of $1 billion, without ever depending on department store shelf space. Here is what almost nobody notices about that story. Gymshark's advantage was never the fabric. Cotton is cotton. A hoodie from one factory in Bangladesh and a hoodie from the factory next door are frequently indistinguishable once the tags are removed. What separates a brand earning $5 of profit per unit from one earning 50 is almost never the product. It's the story wrapped around it. A brand that makes a customer feel like they belong to something, a movement, an identity, a community, can charge 2 or 3 times more for a product that costs the same $8 to sew as its competitors. This is the actual product being sold in the modern clothing industry, not fabric, belonging. Rihanna's Savage x Fenty entered a lingerie market that was already saturated with established players, and it commanded premium pricing, not because the stitching was superior, but because the brand identity, built around size inclusivity and celebrity trust, was something a competitor couldn't replicate by simply undercutting the price. Now let's put a real number on survival, because this is the calculation almost no first-time founder does before they spend their savings. Imagine a small brand spends $30,000 to launch, initial inventory, a website, product photography, and a starter ad budget. If each unit nets, after every real cost, an estimated $10 of true profit, the brand needs to sell 3,000 units just to get back to zero. Not to get rich, just to break even on the money already spent. For a brand with no existing audience, reaching 3,000 sales can take a year, sometimes longer, and every month that passes, rent on the warehouse, subscription software, and advertising costs keep draining the same bank account that's supposed to be recovering. Most founders don't run out of ideas. They run out of runway before the math ever catches up to the marketing. The brands that make it past that point tend to do 3 things. The failed ones don't. They keep inventory risks small early on, often using pre-order models or smaller production runs, even if it costs a little more per unit, because unsold stock is a worse problem than a slightly thinner margin. They build an owned audience, an email list, a repeat community, instead of renting attention from Meta and TikTok forever, because paid advertising costs rise every single year as more brands compete for the same customer, and they resist adding new product lines too early. Many failed brands didn't die from having too few products. They died from spreading a thin margin across 20 styles, instead of protecting the margin on 3. A clothing brand isn't really in the business of selling shirts and hoodies. It's in the business of managing risk, the risk of guessing what a stranger will want to wear months from now, the risk of an algorithm making that stranger's attention more expensive every quarter, the risk of a warehouse full of a color that stopped trending in April. The founders who understand this treat the brand like a finance operation wearing a creative disguise. The ones who don't tend to find out the difference the same month the warehouse invoice arrives. So the next time you see a $60 hoodie and think about the $8 factory cost sitting underneath it, remember, the real price of that hoodie was never printed on the tag. It was buried in the math nobody puts in the caption. Whether that math works out in your favor is, as always, a bet you don't fully see the odds on until you've already placed it.